Chapter 5, Section 6 is the Pythagorean Theorem. In the Pythagorean Theorem, we start with a right triangle. And in a right triangle, the legs are A and B, and the hypotenuse is C. And the Pythagorean Theorem says that if you have a right triangle, then A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So our first one, these are two legs. So you will have 2 squared plus 6 squared equals x squared, which becomes 4 plus 36 equals x squared, which is 40 equals x squared. And from there, we square root both sides. So we end up with x equals the square root of 40. And we were asked to write these in simplest radical form. So we're going to write that as the square root of 4 times the square root of 10. And then when you do the square root of 4 times the square root of 10, that becomes 2 times the square root of 10. Letter B, leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. So 4 squared plus 8 squared equals x squared. That becomes 16 plus 64 equals x squared. 16 plus 64 is 80. And when you square root both sides, x equals the square root of 80. And 80 can be broken down into a 16 times 5. So you end up with 4 times the square root of 5. And that would be your final answer. Letter C is a little bit different. It's the leg we don't know. So we have x squared plus 16 squared equals 20 squared. And in the first two examples, we knew what both of the legs were, so we squared them and added them together. In this case, 16 squared is 256. 20 squared is 400. When we subtract, from there we subtract 256 from both sides, and that becomes x squared equals 144. And when you square root both sides, x equals 12. Letter D, this is a leg and this is a leg. So we will have x squared plus 5 squared equals 8 squared, which becomes x squared plus 25 equals 64. When you subtract 25 from both sides, you have x squared equals 39. And that one cannot be simplified at all. You end up with x equals the square root of 39. Letter E, this time we know both of the legs again. 14 squared plus 48 squared equals x squared. So 14 squared is 196. 48 squared is 2,304. So that becomes 2,500 equals x squared. And when you square root both sides, x equals 50. Letter F, these are legs. So we will have 4 squared plus x squared equals 12 squared. 12 is the hypotenuse. The 4 and the x are the legs. So 16 plus x squared equals 144. When you subtract 16 from both sides, you have x squared equals 128. And I think 128, yeah, if you divide it by 2, well, when we square root this, that will become the square root of 64 times 2. And 64 is a perfect square, so you have 8 square root of 2. Letter G, these are both the legs, and this is the hypotenuse. So 8 squared plus 10 squared equals h squared. 64 plus 100 equals h squared. So 164 equals h squared. And when you square root both sides, that will become a 4 times a 41. And the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 41. Letter H, we're missing a leg this time. So x squared plus 24 squared equals 26 squared. 24 squared is 576. 26 squared is 676. And so we subtract 576 from both sides, and you end up with x squared equals 100. And when you square root both sides, x equals 10. Letter I, 30 squared plus 16 squared equals x squared. 30 squared is 900. 16 squared is 256. 900 plus 256 is 1156 equals x squared. And let's see. That can be, I wonder if 1156 is a perfect square. It is. When you square root both sides, the square root of 1156 is 34. And I didn't know that, so don't be upset if you didn't recognize that one also. Now we have some story problems. Randy is building a picture frame. He wants the ratio of the length to the width to be 3:1 and the diagonal to be 12 centimeters. And the question is, how wide should the frame be? So if this is our picture frame, we want a ratio of 3:1, but it might actually be, this might be a 6 and that might be a 2, or a 9 and a 3. So since this is a ratio, we're going to put x's in there. and our diagonal is going to be 12 centimeters. So, Pythagorean theorem, leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. This becomes x squared, and be careful here. There are two parts inside there, and both of those things need to go to the second power. So that becomes 9x squared equals 144. 1x squared plus 9x squared is 10x squared. Then you divide both sides by 10. And when you square root that, I'm going to call that 3.8. Now all that work is correct, but that's not our final answer. Question is, how wide should the frame be? And this says length to width. So 3 is the length and 1 is the width. And I'm going to do both of these. The length will be 3 times 3.8. And the width just will be the 3.8 centimeters. And the length will be 11.4 centimeters. Letter B, we have a ladder leaning against a building, and according to the recommended safety ratio of 4:1, we want to know how high a 30 feet ladder will reach when placed against a wall. Well, this is the ground and this is the wall, and we're going to lean a ladder up right here. And if you get the base of the ladder too close, when you climb up, you're going to fall backwards. So there's this recommended safety ratio of 4:1. For every 4 feet the ladder goes up the wall, it should be 1 foot away from the wall. And this is a ratio, so we're going to have x's in there. And then the question is, how high will a 30-foot ladder reach? So using our Pythagorean theorem, you will have 1x squared plus 4x squared equals 30 squared. So that becomes x squared plus 16x squared equals 900. 17x squared equals 900. So dividing both sides by 17, x squared equals 52.94. And when you square root that, I'm going to say x is 7.3. And then the question is how high is the ladder up the wall? So you would do 4 times 7.3. And the ladder would be 29.2 feet up the wall. Next we have the converse of the Pythagorean theorem, and that says if the sum of the squares of the lengths of two sides of a triangle is equal to the square of the length of the third side, then it is a right triangle. So the opposite is true. If we know a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then we know we have a right triangle.